Alright, so I'm playing this back at about 4 times speed. The whole sculpt took about 2 hours. This will take about 30 minutes. Now, what I'm working right now with is just the move tool, just trying to sculpt basic stuff into a form, more or less, that conforms to the image planes. It's not about detail, it's just about volume and just getting a basic shape that I can then reliably build on. Okay. So now I'm going to just start going in with the clay buildup tool, just pulling back some of the squarishness of the geometry. Again, I try to reserve detail for later. So right now I'm just trying to work up, where are the landmarks in the face? And I start out with the eye, start out with the back of the behind the chin there, behind the neck, and just try to find out where does the geometry pull out, where does it recess. And again, just trying to find those basic landmarks. Right now, just trying to work on the jaw structure. Kind of looks like he has some silly lips there. And again, just going back and forth between the front view and the side view, always working back and forth, because ultimately you don't want to get stuck in one view. And if you've modeled before, you should probably know that. But it's especially true when you're doing this kind of sculpting, because it can be really simple to start, it can be really tempting to start putting a lot of detail in before you really want to. So what I'm looking at right now is like the brow ridges, how deep the nostrils should be, where they're actually placed. Right now it's sort of this nasal ridge coming down as well. Just putting some basic landmarks right now for the hair on the back there. Took me a little while to figure out precisely how all that hair should flow, but eventually get to it. And then again, constantly going back and forth and reducing the opacity of the sculpt so that I can actually see it bleeding through to the image plane itself. But then I move away from that and I kind of just put the model off to the side and take a look at the image plane and build from there. But then I go back and I just reassess how well is this conforming. Okay. There's a lot of bulkiness on the back of that neck there that I have to take down. And for the most part, I'm just using a combination of the move brush, clay buildup, and occasionally going into using the trim dynamic tool, which is what I'm using right now. Trim dynamic's a nice way to just kind of peel off layers of clay. But more often than not, I actually end up using the clay buildup brush. Also, trying to make pretty obvious recesses, like around where the lips part, around the mouth, just so that it's really obvious where the different landmarks are in the face again. And now I'm just using the snake hook brush to pull up the horns on the top of the head. I find the snake hook works best for this. It's a little tricky to get them to be the right size and to get them to go into the right position, so I'm not too worried about them being perfect to begin with. And then when you pull stuff out with the snake hook brush, it really messes with the tessellation. So I just control click and drag to reset that Dynamesh quite a bit. And the important thing is saving. I always save in iterations. I'll have a Sculpt 01, Sculpt 02, etc. file, and I usually let that correspond to the resolution levels that I'm at. So for instance, between that sculpt that I just saved and this one, I've raised the subdivision level to a Dynamesh level of 256, because I basically got as far as I could go without being able to add more detail to it, so I finally had to move up to a higher level of detail. Now these eyes look a bit silly just hanging there on their own, so it's not until I start layering the eyelids on top that they start sort of sitting in there better. So I always think about what sits the farthest below and what layer is on top. So whatever sits the farthest below within a sculpt, that's what I sculpt first, and then I layer the stuff on top of that. So in this case, layering the eyelids, layering in the sort of muscles around the eyes and all that stuff, that comes in afterwards. It takes some experience to figure out, what are the best things to do first. And you'll see that right up through the end of the sculpt, I'm still making little tiny tweaks to the placement of things. What it looks like in the sketch is not exactly the way that it has to be in the sculpt either, because there's actually differences between the sketch here that we have for the 2D, or that we have from the front and side view. Not everything lines up perfectly. So there is a certain amount of artistic interpretation and sort of reliance on your knowledge of anatomy to make it work better. I'm not too concerned with what's underneath here, because underneath the jaw there, that's going to actually be sitting right on the ring. But it's important to have that volume filled in at the very least. Using the snake hook brush again here to pull out those little horns on the back side of the jaw. And just cutting in with the clay brush right now, just to really make that mouth region more prominent, and adding some lips to the character now. You can see it's coming along already. Still not at a high level of detail, but it's coming along. The big area right now is to start looking at the back of the neck, because, well, there's a lot of scales back here, and I'm looking at how the scales are layered. I'm not using any kinds of alpha textures or stuff like that. I'm doing everything just with the brush, mostly because a lot of that alpha detail just wouldn't hold up in the ring itself, so it's better that I just kind of put it in myself. Right now I'm looking at the hair, just trying to find landmarks in the hair, so kind of the big curl that we have here, some of the other curls, and I'm going to use those as guide points for where I should gouge into the mesh itself. So yeah, now I'm just going to pull some of this hair back. Just trying to keep it to conform as closely as possible to the original sketch. I came to like the sketch more and more as I was working on it. Okay, so just pulling some of that up and simultaneously cutting underneath and then reapplying clay wherever I need it. And occasionally I need to increase the size of these image planes, because I was realizing that when I kept the dragon head so small, it was kind of hard to see the details. So now I'm just I've increased the size of the image planes, and I've tried to resize the head to match them, and I'm just going to lock that down by storing the views in the image planes. And that works out pretty well. Just trying to figure out the top of the head here. Is this a horn or is this the beginning of hair? First I treated it a bit like a horn, but then I started kind of treating it like the actual start of the hairline. These are the little sort of bits of exploration that you come across, the sort of things that the model reveals to you as you're working. And it's kind of interesting that the model can actually reveal information to you. It's not just about you putting information on the model. I think that's one of the reasons why I ended up liking the sketch more in the end, because there was a lot of information there that at first blush I didn't actually see. Okay. So again, just working up with the mostly with the clay build-up tool here. It's a little tricky getting those horns to work right, as I mentioned before. Now I'm just gouging in, trying to create a recess there where the hair is going to stick out more. And this is really kind of the challenge when you're dealing with something like a 3D print or jewelry, especially something that's going to be small like this is going to be. You have to sort of over-exaggerate your depressions and your recesses and your extrusions and stuff like that. So you got to push stuff really far in. You can't just let it be subtle. Subtle will probably not actually appear. Building in some of these horns on the nose there, just trying to get the shape of that front bit of the nose correct. Really trying to figure out what the shape actually is. And again, just resizing up the image planes now for the front view, because I didn't do it for the front view when I did the side view. Now you can see that this doesn't match perfectly, but that's okay. It's close enough. And it gives me enough information to work with, and I can see that the mouth kind of needs to be pushed in here, so it's not so broad. It's kind of a lizard's mouth doesn't typically end up being just a perfect triangle. It has this kind of recess, where it has this sort of push in from around where the eye, around where the tear duct of the eye would be. I'm not sure if lizards have tear ducts. I somehow don't think that they do. But you understand where the tear duct would be on a human, so you can extrapolate that onto a dragon. Okay, just adding a little bit more detail here to the nose. I'm kind of running up to the maximum amount of detail that I can apply at this particular level of Dynamesh subdivision, or Dynamesh resolution. So pretty soon here I'm going to have to move up to the next level. But I really do try to push this as far as I can in order to keep my sculpt honest. And as I mentioned before, the real problem is where you get where you get in the habit of adding too much detail too soon, and that means that you lose sight of the sculpt as a whole. So if you push the sculpt to as far as you can push it all around the model at just a particular level of subdivision, then you're more likely to end up treating the model in a holistic way, as opposed to just a series of separate parts. Okay, just rounding out some of this tricky area around the horns here, making sure that there's enough volume to make it look like there's flesh around the horns, and the horns are actually causing some kind of displacement of the flesh around them. And then just making sure the horns actually look like they're horns, that they're not just some kind of malformed skin. You can get some pinching at times, and a lot of that comes from the fact that when you're dealing with areas that have a geometry that's really thin, you end up pulling the back faces. So if you just go up into brush and auto masking, or brush and masking, I forget exactly what it's called, there is a section in there for back face masking. You can either turn that on or off. Making it so that you can't select the back faces really helps in those areas. There's different sensitivities for it in there as well. Again, just saving the document out. Let's see. Apparently I spent a bit of time on getting this horn right. The horns are pretty definitive things on a dragon. The main thing you have to be concerned with in this case, because they're going to be small, is that they're not too small. So it's possible that making them bigger would actually be better, because otherwise they might not hold in the casting process, or they might have problems 3D printing as well. The other issue, though, is that they're not too sharp and that they don't end up becoming dangerous. So these aren't 100% sharp, but they will still be pretty sharp in the end. But they sort of sit on the ring in a place where they won't cause too much damage if somebody were to come in contact with it. Okay, now just building up that hair again, really looking at where can I craft in some negative space here, or just basically recesses. The more recesses I have, the more the hair is actually going to stick out. And so I'm trying to think of, where does the hair sit on top? So as I go up the skull, I'm having those locks sit on top of the locks that are farther down the skull. And that's already starting to look a lot better. Some of this bulginess around the side of the neck there is not too good. Looks like he swallowed a baby. Okay, now I've just moved up to the 512 resolution. And now it's time to go in for a bit more details. And that allows me, I'm going to start around the eye. The reason for that is just that's usually where this center of attention goes. So whatever detail I put into the eye area, that will be kind of the maximum amount of detail that I want to retain elsewhere. So I decided to try to experiment with this. Can I, for instance, create a depression here in, where that black eye slit is, and make it convincing. But I thought it looked pretty silly, so I undid it. And I just decided to not have that there at all. I just decided to keep it as just a sphere, basically, or what looks like a sphere. Again, these are little things you have to play around with. Maybe somebody else who's more talented at this than I am could figure it out, but I decided that just to keep it simple, it's probably a detail that wouldn't get preserved very well anyway. It wasn't worth it. Looking at creating enough fat folds on the eyes that they feel like they have substance. Also looking at, where does the upper eyelid overlap the lower eyelid. And just adding a mask in here right now so that it makes it easier for me to kind of pull up the lower eyelid here. And that way I can get the lower eyelid to look like it's sort of sitting in front of the eyeball a little bit more as opposed to just coming out from below it. It's a small detail, but it's a pretty important detail, really. I'm just trying to change the shape. I mean, the shape of the eyelids is going to have a big effect on what the mood of the dragon is going to be, or what the emotion of the dragon is going to be. He's, in the sketch, he doesn't look angry, he doesn't look moody, he looks kind of, sort of neutral really, but maybe slightly happy actually. So I didn't want him to look overly aggressive. I wanted it to be sort of a more pleasing dragon. Right now, just adding in some bony ridge bits or scaly bits here to this nasal crest. And just recessing back again, like I said, usually exaggerating this a bit more than what you normally would go for is best when you're working with a sculpture like this, especially a sculpture that's going to be small. Adding a bit more detail around the nose. Now that nose looks a bit wide, so I start pulling that in eventually. So when you add stuff with the clay brush, it's really easy to make things really fat. So then you have to kind of examine them from all different views. Now I really want to go in and really accentuate this mouth line, because this is going to be really important in terms of being able to make a convincing separation between the top and the bottom. So in order to be able to paint or be able to sculpt the top there, I want to mask off the bottom, because I don't want what I'm doing on the top there to affect what's on the bottom. And I'm just going to draw these scales in. I'm not going to use an alpha or anything. So I just make some depressions first to show where the separation between scales is going to be. And just start pulling them, just building them in clay, and I start moving them, eventually actually going to the inflate brush to sort of make them compress together a little bit more. It doesn't look very good at the beginning, but eventually I start improving it. And also working with this general shape here. It's very kind of crocodilian, the shape to the mouth through this region. There we go, using the inflate brush now to tighten up those parts a little bit more. And then constantly going back and reassessing stuff with the move brush. And some of these scales, as I get farther back there, they get larger and they get a little bit less distinct. They get a little bit less detail. And like I said before, it's really easy to sort of make these too large, make them stick out too much. So I just push them back with the move tool. You can use any variety of tools to do this. I just, like I said, I stick pretty closely to just a couple tools. Reverse the mask here and allow myself space to start working on the lower scales. Kind of a question of, what is the shape here? What is the division between where the lower lip ends and where the chin is? create a plane there for the scales to sit on top of. Again, this is just all with the clay brush, or the clay buildup brush, and going back and forth to the move brush to keep things looking correct. Not a lot to say through this section without repeating myself quite a bit. One thing is I'm not too concerned with symmetry in this model. Normally I would say, hey, don't make both sides of the model perfectly the same, especially when you're doing details. But in this case, I don't feel that it's necessary to be that pedantic about it. I think it's fine. I think it's just part of it is needing to save time and just making things work. And because I think in the end, the person who wears this ring isn't going to care. They might not even notice a difference. So if somebody's not going to care, then why bother, really? You can be really obsessive about it, but then it's just sort of wasting your time, and you can be working on other things. Starting to look a bit better. Going back to the inflate tool to tighten up some of these areas, making sure they don't become too fat, and saving it out again, of course. Okay, so now we have some additional detail to add into these little horn sections, and just to make them a bit sharper. So I've used a combination of, actually sort of flattened them out a little bit there using the H polish brush. I'm just looking for, where do the horns sit on top of each other as well. Some of that detail might not actually be preserved in the print, but it's pretty easy to put it in, so I just put it in. Cutting back here, again, creating a much more of a negative space there, basically. You want it to feel like there actually is bone underneath there and that the skin is stretched over bone. You don't want it to feel blobby. So there's a lot of, little important details, not major, big important details, but little important details that help to reinforce that feeling. And now just checking it back to see how well it fits against the front view. There was some discrepancy between the front view and the side view in terms of where those little side horns along the jawline are meant to be. So I just kind of relied on the side view. Now just looking at where do the bones and the muscles here on the top of the jaw sit, and then cutting back here as well. Reinforcing some of these scale patterns. But they are a bit blobby, so I'm just pushing them back. It's good detail to have, but you don't want it to be too fat. Very similar to what we were doing with the scales around the mouth. Tightening up some of these details here on the hair, giving it a little bit more volume. I was looking at separating a few of these into different strands, but didn't really like the way that looked, so I also decided that probably wouldn't hold up in that particular amount of detail. It probably would be too small to be visible in the actual printed version. It's difficult because here I am magnifying this dragon head to an obscenely large size, and yet it's going to be this little part of the head. You need to have basically a little tiny microscope to see, or what we call a loop in our in jewelry. It's like a little magnifying glass. But all the same, you know, some of these details are more important than others, and I just like to see that it actually holds up pretty well all around. So the fatty bit around the nose line there, but that actually has made it a little bit too high, so pulling that back. A little extra scale detail here above the eyes. And it was a little bit of a challenge figuring out, you know, what this sort of fatty, bony ridge thing around the horns should look like. The fun part kind of came here where I started putting the hair in, and it just sort of all came together at this point. I was like, aha, this is what the hair was meant to do. And I think I really started liking the sculpt around this point. There's always that awkward phase in your sculpt where you're looking at it and you're saying to yourself, oh god, I don't want to ever show this to anybody because it looks so terrible. But if you persist with it, you can turn it into something that's quite worthwhile. The workflow that I've discussed here, I think, does a really good job of making sure that that happens. Okay. Again, just looking at some of the musculature in that nose region. I tried working with the rake brush here really briefly to try to add in some extra details, but the rake brush was just too small, so I just did it with the standard brush. So these look really large on screen, but you know, in reality they'll hold up. They'll get the idea across in the actual sculpt, in the actual 3D print as well. So again, just some of those extra details here on the hair. Doesn't look great in the actual sculpt, but it looks better when it's printed at small size. Okay, so just kind of rounding out our last leg here, putting in some very final details on the bony ridges, and you know, I put in more detail than I needed to, so I kind of pulled some of this back. Looks a little bit blobby. So yeah, this just kind of finishes up the sculpt here. So I'm just going to more or less let this play through to the end, and we'll come back and take a look at how to finalize this sculpt onto the top of the ring we made.